My objective is to determine whether there is any better land out there that we might be mining, as this is where I began my life. Parker Schnabel was in the middle of a season-ending catastrophe. He focused on a collapsed mine shaft in the Yukon, a location so hazardous that it was deemed off-limits. Because his operation was at stake, there was more to what he did next than prospect for gold. It has to do with cracking a riddle. His crew discovered something that had been lost to time by penetrating the frozen permafrost with state-of-the-art technology. You threw us a goal that weighed 5,000 ounces. You got that spot on. A 7,000-ounce goal was thrown by you. We've reached a season total of 7,381.1. They discovered a secret gold patch that would lead to an incredible haul worth $75 million. However, everything changed when they discovered the startling finding that led them there. The untouchable prize of Yukon. When you think about it, it's humorous. For a living, these individuals battle freezing earth and wrangle with multi-ton machines. However, some places simply acquire a reputation. They became the subject of legends. The country itself is infused with tales of danger and failure. That's exactly what the Widow's Cut was. A mine shaft so infamously hazardous that it was deemed totally forbidden. No rational individual would try such a quest. The problem with legends, however, is this. Usually, they have a purpose. It wasn't just an old wives' tale passed around campfires that this shaft was too deep and unstable to attempt. The risks were imminent, genuine, and potentially disastrous. First, there was heavy permafrost all around the wound. Let me give you an overview if you have never worked with permafrost before. We're not simply talking about frozen earth here. For thousands of years, this ground has been frozen solid, a mixture of ice, gravel, and soil that is strengthened by concrete. I mean, there's a reason it's called permafrost, because it's frozen forever. We would really benefit from at least 4 hours of temperatures above 35 degrees. In order to keep up with stripping and sloughing simultaneously, we need some warm weather. The issue, though, is that we're already using a large portion of our workforce to simply try to keep the facility supplied. We are discussing land that never thaws, located 150 miles south of the Arctic Circle. You're not only shifting ground when you attempt to delve into it, you are dismantling an old icy stronghold. There's always the dreadful possibility that huge, multi-ton pieces of this frozen rock and dirt will suddenly fall into any artificial aperture. Whoever was unlucky enough to be in the shaft could be hit by tons of frozen ground, with only one mistaken move and one vibration from an excavator at the wrong frequency. Everything else becomes a trivial detail when the ground is good. I'll mine for the benefit of the ground. Careers have been lost in this situation, and worse. There was something much more evil hiding beneath the surface, though, if that wasn't enough to deter miners. The enormous and constant risk of devastating flooding. Any type of water entering, whether from subterranean springs or melted permafrost, might have immediately jeopardized the shaft wall's stability. Consider it this way. The shaky rock and dirt are only held together by the ice. A small increase in temperature or heat from machinery might dissolve that adhesive. And in a matter of seconds, a sturdy wall can turn into a mud torrent. Even worse, in only a few minutes, it may flood and damage heavy mining equipment valued at millions of dollars. Nobody would have been shocked if Parker and his crew had decided the Widow's Cut wasn't for them after just one glance. Given the enormity of the task, it wasn't worth risking their lives and their entire company to retrieve the mountain of riches that the legends promised them down there. The weird part comes next. That is not Parker Schnabel's way of thinking. It's almost as if Parker saw another obstacle to overcome, another mountain to climb, instead of the enormous danger. Perhaps more significantly, Parker viewed this as a challenge he would not back down from. My objective is to determine whether there is any better land out there that we might be mining, as this is where I began my life. Already, the pressure was really high. The workers sensed the walls closing in when the harsh Yukon winter struck the gold fields. The difficulties of obtaining components were a nightmare, and the equipment was breaking down. They had to battle freezing pipes all the time. They needed temperatures above 35°F. for at least 4 hours every day in order to have any chance of making headway. But the weather was not cooperating. However, there was no way to wait for the weather to improve. Time was money, and in the gold mining industry, every day that was lost was money that was leaking out of the business. Tyson, what? Turn it off, Tyson. Something simply exploded. Destroy the feed. Destroy the feed. This watch plant has been exposed to something. For the season, they had aimed for 5,000 ounces. But now that they were up against this monstrous obstacle, they were discussing raising the stakes and coming within striking distance of 7,000 ounces. Given the situation, it was an absurd objective. In one way or another, they were going to descend that shaft. Parker made the decision to fight back against an impossible task, using intellect and sophisticated eyes in the sky rather than physical force. Drones over peril. But it doesn't get any easier just because you accept a challenge. What could then? Contemporary technologies. Parker and his team had a few secret weapons up their sleeves, but the Klondike Gold Rush pioneers relied only on picks, shovels, and sheer willpower. They had access to advanced equipment that allowed them to survey the region in ways that the old prospectors could only have imagined. In addition to their standard equipment of excavators and slopping units, all that was going to alter was their cutting-edge LAR system. The revolutionary nature of this technology for miners is something that is rarely discussed. Light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, is a surveying technique that measures distances using a laser. A LiDAR-equipped drone or aircraft emits millions of laser pulses every second. An extraordinarily intricate three-dimensional representation of the terrain is produced when these pulses reflect off the ground and return to the sensor. The amazing thing about this is that it can see the actual shape of the ground underneath by penetrating through vegetation, loose debris layers, and decades worth of accumulated dirt and overgrowth. Furthermore, they combined it with cutting-edge drone mapping methods. Because it resulted in a breakthrough that miners had been attempting and failing to accomplish since the 1980s. Whomever came up with the combination of these tools deserved a medal. The team's original plan was simple: create a brand new shaft or ramp to descend into the mine. However, given the difficulties posed by permafrost and the ongoing threat of floods, that strategy might turn out to be excessively risky, expensive, and time-consuming. We're just going to have to accept the risk. When the sun decides it's summer, we'll fire up again and use the resources we free up as efficiently as possible for everyone. It gets pretty dangerous pretty quick, one crew member said. They were burning up valuable resources, fuel, money, and time spent working on projects that weren't yielding even a single ounce of gold every hour they spent looking for a route down. They needed to win the widow's cut if they didn't want to end this crucial season with a devastating defeat. They also needed to act quickly. Here, the technology paid off in a way that no one had anticipated. After processing and piecing together the drone and LiDAR data, an amazing discovery was made. Something that has spent decades out of the public eye. The secret that had been lost to time, a secret route into the center of the treasure, was revealed by the lasers as they pierced through the ground and the undergrowth. A collapsed vertical shaft, a remnant of the original mine operation from almost a century ago, that had been totally engulfed by the wilderness and concealed beneath decades of dense, tangled trees and foliage, provided the breakthrough. Despite being lost to time, their exact measurements revealed that the collapsed shaft was moreover 40 meters deep. It is more than 130 feet deep into the ground. They got in that way. Following a thorough analysis, the team determined that stabilizing this collapsed shaft and using it as their entrance point was their best, and possibly only option. Unreasonable demands from a manager who, likes to have unreasonable expectations are present in our current circumstance, along with terminal work. Although it was a terrible idea, they managed to construct a safe enough passageway to descend into the darkness and into the center of the previously unreachable mine, with the help of some sturdy reinforced steel beams and Parker's knowledgeable crew. You can only imagine how the crew's energy changed. Now, after weeks of stress and staring at an impossibly difficult challenge, they had a clear route to the gold they had been seeing. What they would discover at the bottom was simply amazing, yet the unthinkable had suddenly become possible. 10 million in 3 days. Moving through the newly secured shaft didn't take them long. They discovered the stuff of legends at the bottom. They had discovered an unexplored gold vein, rich in quartz, that could provide their entire season with a much-needed boost of several $1,000,000. Parker's on-site geologist said the deposit was the richest and cleanest he had ever seen in his career, since the vein was so pure and flawless. The glistening gold ribbons that were trapped inside the white quartz crystal were actually visible. The team began working nearly feverishly as soon as they had finished admiring the brilliant treasure. The kicker is this: they were aware that they had no time to waste down there. They feared other miners may try to jump their claim if they heard about it. And in the cutthroat environment of the Klondike, rumors of an amazing discovery spread quickly. The team worked non-stop around the clock with that motivated attitude. Mike was working through a ton of material up on the hill. Everyone is exerting every ounce of effort. It becomes really crazy at this point. This unrelenting endeavor turned out to be incredibly successful. After 3 days of relentless labor, they were able to extract nearly 4,000 ounces of gold from this extraordinarily rich vein in just a little more than 72 hours. Give it some time to sink in. 275 pounds of solid gold is equal to 4,000 ounces. They extracted more gold from the ground in 3 days than most mining operations do in a full season. 38.6 ounces, valued at $66,000, were recovered from a single cleanup of a small portion of the pay dirt. And it was only a small sample. They ran the math once they had extracted all that gold, and the results were simply astounding. The value of that first haul exceeded $10 million. For the majority of the season, that one discovery would cover all of their operating expenses, including diesel, salaries, and transportation, leaving millions to spare. You know, it took everyone here, and it's a great accomplishment. I simply wanted to say how much I appreciate all of your hard work. They had never encountered anything like the scope of this revelation. The story becomes even more bizarre, though. They discovered it was far bigger and more widespread than they had first believed after closely examining the gold and the vein's geology. Based on the vein's thickness and estimated length, the team quickly calculated that it actually continued for an additional 2 kilometers. It is approximately 1.4 miles below the surface. At this point, the figures become quite astounding. The team reached a startling conclusion after doing additional calculations that took into consideration the vein's vast size and richness. This one gold vein might provide an additional $75 million for them. Everyone else had written off the possibility of mining $75 million from a single vein in a single place. The squad would have not only a great season, but the most successful season in Gold Rush history if they could do this. They were no longer merely pursuing an objective. They were about to change the course of history. However, news was already spreading. The $75 million scurry. Word spread quickly, almost too quickly. The whole Klondike seemed to be vibrating when word of Parker's incredible gold strike began to spread. There was conversation among competing workers, other miners, and even government inspectors. Everyone was eager to see what Parker had discovered. Parker, however, was prepared. He had previously ensured that the claim was completely legitimate and secured. He and he alone owned the land. Nobody else was receiving any of it. Never, ever. Everyone in the Yukon was observing. They weren't merely observing, they were conversing. Through supply towns and mining camps, whispers flew. Was this the largest strike of gold in the 21st century? Had Parker simply changed the game's rules? Watching this from home and believing it's all a case of luck is simple, but let's face it. In a place like the Yukon, is anything ever that easy? What isn't shown must be a mystery. The restless evenings, the ongoing stress, and the worry that one mistake may bring everything to an abrupt end. This was more than just a gold pot discovery. A force was being unleashed. In an effort to keep Big Red running, Mitch and I recently began working nights here. You worked all day and went to work all night, you know. The burden on Parker's shoulders abruptly doubled, as he now needed just 174 ounces to reach his 7 ounce season objective. Pressure increased as wealth and attention increased. Now everyone was staring at him. Could he guide his group through the tidal waves of celebrity, avarice, and high expectations? Or would the extreme scrutiny cause everything to start to break apart? There isn't a straightforward solution to this section of the story. When you win this large, you draw more than just praise, you draw trouble. Rivalry, jealousy, and the risky temptation to take even greater chances may ensue. It was obvious. Parker's crew would not be the only ones impacted by this finding. It might alter the Klondike's whole ecology. Prices for land can soar. In search of their own prize, more miners may swarm the area. Tossing a boulder into a still lake was analogous. The repercussions would be far-reaching. Parker, however, was not afraid. He was intent. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and he wasn't going to let it pass him by. He had endured harsh terrain, brutal weather, equipment failures, and disastrous seasons. However, this was not like the others. This was an opportunity to become more than just another successful young person. It was an opportunity to make history. Parker simply got lucky, according to some. His instinct will be credited by others. Ultimately, however, the combination of state-of-the-art technology, unyielding resolve, and the sheer courage to take on what others deemed impossible had paid off in the most spectacular way. The world was listening as the Klondike monarch made his move. Parker Schnabel had turned a death trap into a famous windfall that would be discussed for generations after his $75 million wager paid off. You threw us a goal that weighed 5,000 ounces. You got that spot on. A 7,000-ounce goal was thrown by you. We have 7,381 for the season. One for the season. Has Parker's extraordinary success simply made him a huge target and exposed him to a new threat? Please share your thoughts below. Remember to subscribe and like.